All right, we're going to try something a little different on these slides. We'll see if this is any better or any worse. Won't know till tomorrow till we see this, so that's okay. So our next climate zone, the last climate zone really here in the low latitude zones, is a region that we call the humid subtropical climate zone. Now, this humid subtropical climate zone is probably the best low latitude zone there is. The closest thing that we have like this here in the United States is something like a Florida or a South Carolina, where it's going to be extremely hot, extremely humid, lots of moisture, very rare snowfall. It will snow once in a while, but it's gone within a day or two and it's 70 degrees again. We typically find lots of vegetation here. There's lots of rainfall, lots of vegetation. Very good for agricultural products, particularly cash crops again, peanuts, tobacco, sugar, rice, fruits, veggies, etc. And we tend to see very dense population distribution. Of the low latitude zones, this is the one that is hospitable because it's warm, which people like. There's plenty of moisture, which you can then grow crops. There's plenty of animals, which you can hunt, that you can eat. You can raise animals in an agricultural setting. We tend to find humid subtropical climates in a plain setting. Now, Florida, South Carolina, the low country as it's called, you won't find as much, but in Africa there's much larger chunks of real estate where we find this humid subtropical climate. And this is going to be generally closer to, say, a large body of water that's going to provide ample rainfall and moisture. You're not going to be as regulated by the monsoon winds as, say, a savanna. You're going to have more rainfall, more consistent rainfall year-round. So you're going to be located typically closer to some kind of ocean, which is going to keep your weather a little bit more consistent. Most of the businesses in this humid subtropical climate are going to be in the agricultural industry as well, particularly in Africa, where you're going to grow bananas and oranges and apples and whatnot, because that's what grows well in a humid subtropical climate. Really, this humid subtropical is the one climate out of all these other climates that allows us to function in a semi quote-unquote normal way when we talk about agricultural production, population distributions, etc. All the others have some major flaws that make it very hard to live there. But in a humid subtropical climate, that's not necessarily the case. All right, so as we move on, we look at, say, our middle latitude climate zones. Our middle latitude climate zones are going to be as we get further and further away from the equator. So if you think of the low latitude zones from 30 degrees north to 30 degrees south, this is going to be 30 degrees north of the equator to 30 degrees south of the equator. There's not a lot of these areas in Africa because most of Africa fits into that 30 to 30 climate zone, where we see the 30th north parallel and the 30th southern parallel line of latitude. And so that typically is where we're going to see this. Generally in the world, if we generalize to the entire world, this is where we find most of our population bases. It is true in Africa to some degree as well, but there's so much coastline in Africa, it kind of moderates a lot of the extremes of the African climate. But it is generally true in the world that most of your world's population is in these middle latitude zones. That would include the United States. It would include Europe. It would include most of Asia, about the northern half of China. It would include all of Brazil, Argentina. It would include Australia. These are going to be areas that are extremely, extremely, extremely densely populated because they're very good for agricultural production traditionally, and because of their seasonal climates. Their seasonal climates allow them to be more productive. For example, in the desert climate, in a tropical desert climate, you have the country of Egypt. Egypt is a desert climate, even though it's close to the 30 degrees north latitude. The problem that they have in Egypt, for example, is that they have 3 growing seasons a year. So, for example, you can grow crop in Egypt 3 different times a year. Plant, harvest, plant, harvest, plant, harvest in one calendar year. In Iowa, we do it one time. You get 100 days, that's it. Because they get 300 days a year in Egypt, they can be almost as productive as here in Iowa. So they get 3 growing seasons in one year in a country like, say, Egypt on the Nile River Valley, which is extremely, they have tremendous water and whatnot available to them there. But the problem that they run into there is that they don't have the ability, their soil is so not good because it's so tired and so beaten up that it takes tremendous amount of effort and time to put in fertilizer, etc. So the seasonal climates are actually better for growing crops than the warm climates. Then you throw in the fact that in the warm climates they have problems with pest infestations, animal infestations that they can't get rid of. In Iowa, we have this thing called winter, which takes care of a lot of our problems. So it's just another idea that allows us to do that. So as we look at these middle latitude zones, there's really only two that are found in Africa. The first of these is like the ideal climate zone. It's called the Mediterranean climate zone. Mediterranean climate zone is the perfect weather. 30 to 35 degrees north latitude, very small climate zone, usually located around a large warm sea. So in Africa's case, that would be, the Mediterranean. It could be located along a lake if you have a very large lake, like in Russia, they have one along the Aral Sea, which is really nothing but a big lake. It is the most temperate climate, very mild winters, dry, low humidity in the summers. It's just like the perfect climate. It rains every night for 1 hour. The next morning you wake up, there's no rain, it's beautiful weather, 75 degrees in the wintertime, in the summertime. In the wintertime it cools down all the way to 70. It's just perfect climate. Main agricultural products here are going to be citrus fruits, flowers, veggies, because it's really the only climate where these things can grow. So they can grow anything in these climates. They could grow corn, they could grow beans, they could grow rice. But they choose to do citrus fruits, flowers, veggies, etc., because that's all that they can do. I mean, this is the only climate that they can do it in. So you can't grow citrus fruits in Iowa. You can't grow citrus fruits in Egypt, in the deserts. You just can't. And so the Mediterranean climate is typically where we find those things, and thus it is a very highly prized climate zone. Obviously located only along warm seas, so like the east coast of Egypt along the Red Sea, obviously along the Mediterranean Sea, maybe along the east coast of Africa on the warm side of the Indian Ocean. That it might be there, but it just kind of depends on the currents of the ocean and whatnot that are going to affect it. And typically the Mediterranean climate zone is a small sliver, maybe 7-8 miles wide. It's not going to be very far inland, because then once you get further inland, the further inland you go, the more you are impacted by continental climate shifts, which is going to be wind, seasonal weather, etc. The last climate zone is going to be what we would call a marine climate. A marine climate is similar to what you're going to see in, say, a Seattle. Cooler, not going to be as warm as a Mediterranean climate, a lot more moisture than in a Mediterranean climate. It's usually a climate that gets impacted a lot by the rain shadow effect, so it's going to be located between an ocean and a mountain range, and you're going to see it be very arid, lots of water, lots of green trees, a lot of green growth, but it's not necessarily terribly hospitable for human growth because it's not very good weather. Agricultural production is not going to be great here because there's not enough sunshine to grow crops. You're typically going to find this along the coastlines of Africa, like the extreme coast, like the extreme southern coast of South Africa. The east coast of Africa typically is going to have a marine climate because of the rain shadow effect. The Indian Ocean is the cold side of the Indian Ocean. Up north it's a little bit warmer, but in the southern part, so it's going to be a much cooler climate. It's much like in the United States. The Atlantic Ocean is very warm, the Pacific Ocean is very cold. Thus, the climate of the West Coast is impacted quite a bit by the Pacific Ocean to make it much cooler than it probably would normally be. On the East Coast, it's much warmer than it would probably be. So those are the impacts that we see there. When we talk about these climate zones, these Mediterranean and marine climate zones, these two climate zones are really the only two middle latitude zones. Obviously, there's no high latitude zones. If you find cold weather in Africa, it's typically going to be at a high altitude. So like you see this picture up here in the top right-hand corner, you'll see an extremely high altitude. You'll see some snowfall or some cold weather, but that's really about it. So, those are the climate zones of sub-Saharan Africa, not even sub-Saharan Africa, really of all of Africa. And those are the primary climate zones, and to some degree, every part of Africa fits into one of those climate zones. We'll talk about these again. Have a good day.